All right, we're going to jump around a little bit. We'll start with the first 5 verses in 2 Samuel 11. So if you want to turn there, you can follow along as we read, or obviously they will be on the screen as well, the verses. We're going to jump, after the first 5 verses of chapter 11, we're going to jump to chapter 12 of 2 Samuel and read the first 9 verses there. And then we're going to read Psalm 51 together. So let's read from God's Word. In the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. Late one afternoon, after his midday rest, David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace. As he looked out over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. He sent someone to find out who she was, and he was told, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her, and when she came to the palace, he slept with her. She had just completed the purification rites after having her menstrual period. Then she returned home. Later, when Bathsheba discovered that she was pregnant, she sent David a message saying, "I am pregnant." And then from chapter 12, starting in verse 1. So the Lord sent Nathan the prophet to tell David the story. There were 2 men in a certain town. One was rich and the other was poor. The rich man owned a great many sheep and cattle. The poor man owned nothing but one little lamb he had bought. He raised that little lamb, and it grew up with his children. It ate from the man's own plate and drank from his cup. He cuddled it in his arms like a baby daughter. One day, a guest arrived at his home of the rich man. But instead of killing an animal from his own flock or herd, he took the poor man's lamb and killed it and prepared it for his guest. David was furious. "As surely as the Lord lives," he vowed, "any man who would do such a thing deserves to die. He must repay 4 lambs to the poor man for the one he stole, for having no pity." Then Nathan said to David, "You are that man. The Lord, the God of Israel, says, I anointed you king of Israel and saved you from the power of Saul. I gave you your master's house and his wives and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And if that had not been enough, I would have given you much, much more. Why then have you despised the word of the Lord and done this horrible deed? For you have murdered Uriah the Hittite with the sword of the Ammonites and stolen his wife." So turn over to Psalm 51. The words of David. "Have mercy on me, O God, because of your unfailing love. Because of your great compassion, blot out the stain of my sins. Wash me clean from my guilt. Purify me from my sin. For I recognize my rebellion. It haunts me day and night. Against you and you alone have I sinned. I have done what is evil in your sight. You will be proved right in what you say, and your judgment against me is just. For I was born a sinner. Yes, from the moment my mother conceived me. You desire honesty from the womb, teaching me wisdom even there. Purify me from my sins, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. Oh, give me back my joy again. You have broken me. Now let me rejoice. Don't keep looking at my sins. Remove the stain of my guilt. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a loyal spirit within me. Do not banish me from your presence, and don't take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and make me willing to obey you. Then I will teach your ways to rebels, and they will return to you. Forgive me for shedding blood, O God, who saves. Then I will joyfully sing of your forgiveness. Unseal my lips, O Lord, that my mouth may praise you. You do not desire a sacrifice, or I would offer one. You do not want a burnt offering. The sacrifice you desire is a broken spirit. You will not reject a broken and repentant heart, O God. Look with favor on Zion and help her. Rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will be pleased with sacrifices offered in the right spirit, with burnt offerings and whole offerings. Then bulls will again be sacrificed on your altar." What a story. What a story. I want to start by talking about David and Bathsheba. And this is It's not just a story. It's a difficult story. It's a story with a lot of sin. It's a story with a lot of cover-up. It's a story with a lot of David being really just quite terrible. And so what do we do with that when he's called a man after God's own heart? Well, let's start with talking about what he does in this story. First, we see from the very get-go that he neglects his duties as king. Chapter 11 starts out by telling us that he doesn't go off to war in the times when kings go off to war. So while the Israelite army is engaged in a battle across the Jordan River, David engages in his own battle at home. He fights a different kind of battle, a personal struggle of temptation. And some have tried to explain this detail away, that perhaps he's just giving Joab the chance to be a really good commander. David doesn't need to be there in the lead because he trusts Joab. He's a good commander. He can send him out with the army and know that the job will get done. Okay, maybe. I find that thinking a bit spurious. Joab, for starters, is already an accomplished commander. He doesn't need practice battling in the field. He doesn't need practice commanding an army. He's done that for a long time. He's already an accomplished commander. This is not the kind of opportunity that he needs to grow in his commandership. He's already really good at that. But the second and main reason, I think, is that the storyteller is telling us from the very beginning, David is in the wrong. David doesn't go off to war when he's supposed to. That's how the story begins. And we're given that detail on purpose. We are intentionally being set up to understand that what David is doing in this story is wrong. And it begins by him not fulfilling his duties as king. All right, so then after neglecting his duties, we see that he falls deeper and deeper into sin. He focuses on his own desires, right? Notice we don't get any detail about him taking care of Bathsheba, having concern about her role in this story. Every detail is about David. He takes control of the situation. He views her from a distance. He notices her, and then he wants her. He cares only about his own desires and not looking away when he should from Bathsheba. And David had a choice to look away, didn't he? If you remember, a few weeks ago, we talked about the story, I guess more than a few weeks ago, we talked about the story of Joseph. When Joseph is confronted with a sexual temptation with Potiphar's wife, what does he choose to do? He chooses to flee from it, right? Not David. David dives in head first, right? The pool's empty, but he's going in anyway, because that's what David does. And it gets him into a lot of trouble in this story. And then finally, he sinned deliberately. He doesn't just go deeper and deeper into sin. He sins deliberately by forcing Bathsheba to go to bed with him. Now, I wasn't there when this moment occurred. None of us were. All I have to go off of is what the text says, what we know about ancient cultures, and what we know about humans in general. And many people have tried to place some sort of blame on Bathsheba. I've heard it a lot in my years of study. I've read it a lot in my years of study that, well, she should have just said no, she could have covered up, she didn't have to be out bathing, all those kind of things. And we're going to talk about some of those details. That, to me, is really quite ludicrous. But nowhere in this story does the narrator tell us at all that Bathsheba is at fault one iota. The blame is squarely placed on David. And so I think it's a false reading for us to look back and say, well, Bathsheba should have done this, or she could have said this, or done something differently. I don't really think so. I don't want to come to that here in just a moment. I think it's very clear that the blame and the guilt is placed upon David, or ought to be placed upon David. And some people may wonder, but she didn't have to say yes, did she? Right? She could have said no. And the truth is, I don't think that's true at all. I think absolutely not. She did not have the opportunity to say no. Think about the position that Bathsheba is in versus the position that David is in. And let's talk about power here for a moment. Is Bathsheba in a position of any power whatsoever in this story? No. She's up against the king. What is she supposed to do? She could have been screaming no the whole way as David's guards dragged her from her house to his palace. What would anybody do? Who's going to fight the king's guards when the king gets what he wants? Nobody. There's absolutely no reason to assume that Bathsheba is in any form of position of power here. David is the king. Again, perhaps she did say no. But even if she didn't, what good would it have done? So let's assume that she did. Clearly didn't do any good. She's completely beholden to David's power in this story. And the truth is, David knows it. David knows it. Also, throughout chapter 11, just, again, setting up this idea of David being the one in a position of power. The verb send or sent is used several times in chapter 11. All of those uses are by David. David sends for Bathsheba. David sends for Uriah to come back. David sends Uriah back to the front lines. David sends messengers back and forth. A person who sins is a person in a position of power. David is the king. He has the right, he has the power to send for somebody, and they come. He has the right to send his army where it's supposed to go. He has the right to send for one of his troops to come back. And Uriah does. But in chapter 12, verse 1, Nathan is sent. But by whom is Nathan sent? God. So I really think what the narrator is telling us, he's setting up a false idea of power in chapter 11. David views himself as in control of his life, as in control of the situation, as in control of the people that he's in control of. But God does the sending in chapter 12. And that's where David is convicted. So there's really this great role reversal. David doesn't have much power at all. At least it's only perceived power. It's only human power. God's power is real. God's power to convict David, a man after God's own heart, is the real power in the story. And so let's talk about that phrase, a man after God's own heart. Well, this has been a suspect phrase to use about David forever. I mean, people have gone back and forth. Why is this phrase used of David, of all people, when we see such a horrendous episode in his life here in these chapters? And I've heard a lot of people defend David over the years. Over and over again, Christians in particular have rushed to David's defense. And I think a lot of that has to do with the connection to Jesus, of course. Jesus is the king forever in the line of David, right? And so there's this idea we want to prop up the hero. We want him to turn out like we want him to be. We want him to be as perfect as Jesus is because he's David. That's not the story we have, though, right? That's always been a curious thing to me why we do that, but again, I think I know why. But in connection with this phrase, I want to think about the law here for a moment. Think back, again, several weeks ago, we talked about the Ten Commandments. You remember when we went through those? We did 5 weeks on them, 2 apiece. It seems to me that David went against, at least 5 of the 10 Commandments. He broke at least 5 of the 10 Commandments. So let's talk about these. Commandment number 6 is, do not murder. Did he break that? Yeah. A little bit, right? As he sends for Uriah to come back to try to deceive Bathsheba, to try to deceive the people around him. And when Uriah refuses, what does David do? He sends him to the front line so that he'll be killed. Maybe he didn't stab him on his own, but he certainly created the conditions under which Uriah would die. Let's call that murder. Commandment number 7 is, do not commit adultery. Let's just keep going because there's no explanation for that one. He just did that one, right? Commandment number 8, do not steal. Did he break that? I say yes. Remember, when Nathan confronts David with the story of the wealthy and the poor man, and he talks about the wealthy man, rather, stealing the one lamb that the poor man has, he says, that's you. You have stolen the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So, I think it's pretty clear we're being told that David is breaking commandment number 8. All right, that's 3. Commandment number 9, do not bear false witness. Did he break that commandment? Well, since the base of that commandment is that a person is to remain truthful at all times, right? That a person's, their very integrity is at stake when they base their life on lies or on a lie, then I think absolutely David broke this commandment. Remember, he deceived, or he attempted to deceive Uriah by bringing him home and creating conditions under which Uriah might think that Bathsheba's child was his. And of course, Uriah, it's an interesting juxtaposition here. We have David, a man after God's own heart, Uriah, a foreigner, a Hittite, showing greater faith in God, showing greater solidarity and loyalty to his friends and his fellow soldiers by not sleeping with his wife than David does. So, I think David's a liar. Commandment number 10. Do not covet your neighbor's house or your neighbor's wife. Did he break that? Yes. Again, that one's pretty airtight. We don't need any explanation of that one. And so here we have a man after God's own heart who broke not 1, not 2, but 5. 5 of the most sacred commandments that we read in Scripture. 5 of the most sacred commandments that we read in Scripture. I don't know, but I struggle with calling a person who does that a man after God's own heart. He's not the hero in the story that we want to make him out to be. And I think for Christians to try to claim that he is some kind of hero in the story, it's really disingenuous to the text. It doesn't treat it seriously. And look, I'm not trying to say that David is always bad in all circumstances, in every, aspect of his life. That's not what I'm saying. But I think the hoops that people have tried to jump through to argue on David's behalf in this story in particular, it doesn't make us look good. It makes us look like we're not treating the text seriously, because his behavior shows that he breaks 5 of the 10 commandments. All right, enough about David. I want to talk about Bathsheba for a moment. What does she do in this story? Well, as I've already kind of stated, she doesn't really get to do a whole lot. Bathsheba we don't see the story from her perspective. So we don't see her actions. We don't see any words even from her. She doesn't say anything in this story. And so what do we have to go on? Well, before sleeping with David, we do know that she commits one action. She goes on her roof to bathe. Now, many, especially in our culture, in our time, have looked back at this and said, that's really strange. She clearly was trying to trap David into some kind of sexual temptation. Like she's being a temptress here and trying to trap him in sin. And the truth is, what we know about ancient cultures is, that's just not true. People in the ancient world bathed on their roofs all the time. All the time. Men and women. Now let's think about why they did that. Well, we have this wonderful thing called indoor plumbing. I love it. You all love it. It's fantastic. We turn water on, it goes down the drain, and somewhere that I don't know, processing plant, I don't care. I mean, whatever. It's out of my house. That's all I care about, right? They don't have that. So where do you go to get clean? What if you're not near a pond or a lake or a river that you can go wash? If you live in a big city like Jerusalem, you bathe on the roof of your house. Why? Well, what happens when water is outside in the hot sun? What does it do? It goes away magically. It evaporates, right? So it's a natural place to want to go bathe because the water is going to go away. But they also, in their homes, on top of their roofs, they would cut little slits out along the sides So what would the water then get to do? Just drain off. The roof is actually a very natural place for them to want to go bathe. And so they did, all the time. So for us to read back in the story and say, oh, Bathsheba clearly then, come on, she was just trying to trap David here. She's clearly some kind of vile temptress, doing some nefarious thing by bathing on the roof. No. That is not at all how an ancient Israelite would have read this story and understood what Bathsheba is doing. Her behavior in this story is completely and perfectly normal to them. And so it ought to be to us. I know it isn't, but it ought to be read that way. Okay? We have to put our 21st century preconceived notions and ideas about life aside. But another thing here is that at no point is there any motive ascribed to Bathsheba in the story. The narrator never once tells us Bathsheba is trying to trap David to sin. You'd think that would be an important detail if it were true, right? If we were meant to understand Bathsheba as being some nefarious, evil, vile temptress in the story, you'd think the narrator would at least hint at it a little bit, but we don't get that anywhere. All right. We also just get very little else about Bathsheba or her actions in the story, as I've already said. So then, the question, why is she so important? Well, first, like Ruth that we covered for the last 4 weeks, her situation is forced upon her. She has very little, if any, choice in what happens. Again, we've already touched on that. I don't think she had a choice in whether David, forced himself on her or not. So like Ruth, she's in a situation where she has very little choice in the matter of what's happening around her. But secondly, and more importantly, I think, is that her womb, let's remember what we talked about with Ruth. With Bathsheba, this is true as well. Her womb is a womb that bears a child of promise. As we discussed with Ruth in the previous weeks, Bathsheba is blessed to be a mother of one of the children who is part of the ancestry of Jesus. And like Ruth, Bathsheba is mentioned in Jesus' genealogy. It's interesting, if you go back and you read in Matthew 1, the genealogy, Matthew doesn't use Bathsheba's name. He just says, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And I wonder if Matthew is doing some kind of, hey, let's remember how horrible she had it in this story, right? Like she's an important person, but it wasn't all her choice what went on. But so why is she important then? Well, because like Ruth, she finds herself in a situation not of her own making, not of her own choosing, but she allows herself to be used by God nonetheless. I can't help but wonder what she might have been thinking as David not only forced himself upon her, but then after David kills her husband, he takes her as his wife. It doesn't say she goes willingly. The text says he takes her as his wife. And then Solomon is the child of promise, born. I wonder what must have been going through her mind all those years as she lived in the house of David, knowing the man who not only essentially raped her, but also killed her husband. And she has to live with him day in and day out. What a horrible situation she must have felt like she was in, living in that palace. I think sometimes we forget about Bathsheba in this story and only focus on David. So let's talk about sin. Everybody's favorite topic. Sin. What do we do about sin? I mean, clearly that's what this story is about. It's about David's sin, right? So what do we do about it? Well, I want to start by talking about Nathan's role in this story. Let's think back to who Nathan is. He's a prophet, right? He's not a priest. He's not royalty. He's a prophet. What was one of the major roles that a prophet was to perform in the nation of Israel? To call out sin. To point out where they are turned in the wrong direction away from God, to lead them back toward God. Nathan does that. Even in what I would assume is an incredibly uncomfortable situation. Hey, Nathan, why don't you go confront the king about his personal sin? Hey, Nathan, why don't you march up to the palace and in front of David and his advisors say, hey, David, remember what you did in sinning? Let's talk about that. Let's air your dirty laundry for everybody to hear and to know about. Okay. That's not really something you do before a king, is it? Nathan fulfills his role as a prophet anyway. I love his faithfulness in this story. The truth is, the role that Nathan fulfilled for David, the role that Nathan fulfilled for the people of Israel, is the same role that you and I have for each other as well. While most of you wouldn't classify your role as being a prophet, and I would agree with you, you're not prophets. We are told by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 12 and 13, he says, it isn't my responsibility to judge outsiders, but it is certainly your responsibility to judge those inside the church who are sinning. God will judge those on the outside, but as the Scriptures say, you must remove the evil person from among you. Confronting sin can be really difficult, right? Not just in our own lives. I mean, that's hard enough. It's hard enough to go before God and say, all right, God, here are the 50 ways I've messed up in the last month. That's hard. But to come alongside a fellow Christian and say, hey, you've got something wrong in your life. We have to talk about it. That's really, really difficult. That's what Nathan does here. That's what we are called to do. But then add on to that, a person in power, a person of great wealth like David, makes that even more difficult, right? We are called to be each other's judges. And we don't like that. That rubs us the wrong way. I don't want you judging me. I mean, I'll just say that. I don't want you judging me. But you're supposed to. You are supposed to. We've got to take that seriously. Because we have to call each other back into right relationship with God. Paul talks about it in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. He talks about a ministry of reconciliation. He's not just talking about professional ministers like me. He's talking about each and every one of us having a ministry of reconciliation whereby we help take other people from a lost state, from a state of sin, present them before God, holy and clean. You have that responsibility, same as I do. We also need to, like David in Psalm 51, we have to root our appeal. He does this in Psalm 51. We have to root our appeal in God's character, in His mercy and in His unending love, rather than in self-justification. And we're really good at self-justification, aren't we? We're really good at excusing away our sin. Oh, God, it was just a little bit of gossip. I mean, somebody else told me. How am I not supposed to pass on that information to somebody else, right? God, it was just a little lie. I just didn't want them to know the whole truth, because if they know the whole truth, then they won't be my friend. We're really good at self-justification. We're really good at excusing away our own sin. And so because of that, I think often we failed to be truly contrite. And instead of praying about our sin and recognition of God's amazing grace toward us, we attempt to justify it before God. We like justifying our behavior. And so we seek to mitigate our own culpability because we just don't want to admit. We just don't want to admit that we could be quite that bad. And that has to stop. The way we treat our own sin in our life has to stop. Instead, like David, we have to beg from God something that we don't have any intrinsic right to at all, and that is His forgiveness. So I want to talk about Psalm 51, verse 4 for just a moment. I want to end here. This has always been a really difficult verse for me. If you don't remember what it says, the paraphrase is, David says, against you and you alone have I sinned, O Lord. That's the part that at least bothers me. So I want to talk about that for a moment. Because David declares that it's against God and God alone that he has sinned. And I want to ask the question, on a quick reread of chapters 11 and 12, is it against the Lord and the Lord alone that David has sinned? No. So what do we do with that verse? I've really struggled with this for years upon years. I have disliked Psalm 51 because of that one verse. Because I don't think David is completely honest in it about the way that he treated Bathsheba, about the way that he treated Uriah, how he treated his army, how he treated all the people around him. It has bothered me for a really long time. So what do we do with it? All right, what do we do with it? How are we supposed to understand it? As I thought about it this week, I came up with nothing. I'm just going to be honest. I came up with nothing on my own. I mean, this is one of those moments where I'm deeply trying to figure this out within my own heart and my own spirit, and I'm just coming up empty, right? It's a dry well. So I dove into my commentaries that I've gotten, and all of them were terrible. I mean, they're all just basically explaining it just a simple explanation away from it, like, well, just kind of ignore it, forget about it, David, whatever. But then I came across one that I really liked. I don't think it fully solves it for me, but I want to kind of tell you what it said, because I really did like it. What this commentator said is that he understands this verse from a standpoint that apart from God's relationship to humanity, there would be no sin. Let me restate that. Apart from God's relationship to humanity, there is no sin. Because all sin, whether great or small, is a breakdown in relationship between humans and God. And so David's insistence upon the fact that he is sinning against God, I think this commentator's right. It's a recognition of that fundamental truth, that all sin ultimately goes back to a broken relationship between us and God. Yes, we affect other people with our sin. We do. Even that little white lie that you've told, you've affected other people around you, whether you know it or not. But ultimately, it's a breakdown in a relationship between us and God. For it is God and God alone whose way and will are the criteria for human acts which reveal them as sin. It's upon God's standard of justice, of right and wrong, that we even understand what sin is. And so because of that, I think that's what David is driving at here. It's God's oversight, His divine oversight of human life, that makes sin meaningful and necessary to talk about at all. Now, while I find that explanation helpful, it doesn't fully do it for me. I'm not fully on board with the way that David still talks about his sin. I would love for, maybe immediately after that, for David to go, at least in parentheses, okay, but I really screwed up with Bathsheba and Uriah. And then continue on, because that would have felt more, genuine to him, what he did in the story. But he does confess, right? So I want to give him that credit. He does confess. He does repent of his sin. He does ask God for the forgiveness that he needs in his life. And that's how we need to be with our own sin. Recognize where we're wrong and make that confession to God. And so we need to make sure that we don't behave as David did and act simply because we can. You notice how he did that with Bathsheba. The actions that David takes, he takes simply because he is king and he knows that he can get away with it. Who is going to challenge the king in this story? And so one question that I have to conclude is, do we allow the power that we think we have over others to dictate our behavior toward them? If you look at yourself as better than another human being, if you look at yourself as higher above them in some way, if you view yourself as having power over other people, it changes how you interact with them. And is it changing you in such a way that you're treating them as less than you? Are you treating them as though you can get away with what you want to simply because you have that power? David was hit with this bug. He could not get out of his own way when it came to this problem. I don't want us to be like that. The second thing, are we fulfilling our duty to confront sin in our own lives and in the lives of each other? Do you take that role seriously that Nathan did? That you have a duty to look at other people in this room, other people who profess belief and worship in the same God that you do, that you hold them accountable for the sin that's in their life. If you're not, if you're just letting somebody get by with the sin that you know is right there, that they've been ignoring and that you've been ignoring, then I got to tell you, you're in the wrong. And you are partly responsible for them getting out of it. Now, you can't change them, right? You can't make them behave differently. But it is your responsibility to point it out and to help them walk through it. And then finally, are you making confession a regular part of your spiritual life? While I may be bothered by verse 4 of Psalm 51, I still recognize it as a great psalm of confession. And the truth is, our brotherhood, the churches of Christ, we've been really terrible about confession. It is not something that we've emphasized the last 200 years. We've ignored it, mostly. And I think that comes from a desire to really kind of sweep our own sin under the rug. We just don't want to deal with it. I mean, I'm about to offer a time of confession, for you to come forward, and if there's something you need, you can do that. But the truth is, over the years, we've really not taken it as seriously as I think we should. And so, are you making confession, the confession of your sins, a daily, a weekly, a monthly, a yearly habit? Getting it off your chest, being completely open and contrite before the Lord, as David says in Psalm 51, that what God desires is a contrite and broken heart. Or are you fine with the sin in your life? You don't need to confess it. It's a convicting story. And Psalm 51 is a convicting psalm. And so I hope this morning that you're taking to heart the seriousness that sin plays in our lives and the way that it affects us and everybody around us. And so we are going to have a moment where you can come forward. We're going to stand and sing in just a minute. But you can receive prayers if you come forward. You can confess if something's going on in your life that you need to share with us. If you want to be baptized, come up as a new creation in God. We want to celebrate with you. And so we're going to have that time that if you have any need at all, for you to come as we stand and sing.